Hey friends, welcome back to Homestead on a Prayer. It is a hot, sticky, early July morning out here. I'm filming this video first thing in the morning because it's only going to get hotter and stickier as the day goes on. And we are well into gardening season now. As you can see a little bit behind me, the garden is going strong, plants are growing. We're starting to actually get some significant harvests, so it's a really exciting time in the garden. But one thing we don't want to forget about when it comes to this time of year is continuing the season on as long as possible. Now, you may think, okay, it's July. Garden season is well underway. We're actually, as much as it pains me to say it, in some places starting to kind of count down to the first frost of the season. And so you may be thinking, okay, there isn't really time to start anything new. We're just going to focus on keeping what we have going healthy and getting as much of a harvest from that as possible. And those are great goals. But I do want to encourage you to not forget about starting new things because, as I said, the goal of the garden, at least as far as I'm concerned, one of the goals of the garden, is to get as much harvest possible and as long of a harvest season possible. Now, even though it is July, and admittedly the season is a lot shorter now than it was back in May when we had our last frost date, there are still a lot of things that you can still start even from seed in the garden. So today I'm just going to share with you some of the plants that I'm still starting from seed in my garden even in July. So in a lot of ways, July, at least in my area, is really peak garden season. And it's the time when you think about getting a big harvest. But the thing with that harvest, as you can see, this is my garlic bed here, which is all going to be harvested really soon. The thing with that harvest is that when you harvest something like garlic that takes up a big bulk of the garden, once you harvest that, you're going to have space. And at least in my garden, I don't like to leave that space empty. I like to make sure that my garden's getting used to its full potential. So when I harvest this garlic in about a week, I'm going to be thinking about what I can plant here to take its place. Now you can see here, I brought out my seed containers so that we can go over lots of good ideas for planting this time of year. Now, when it comes to starting plants from seed this late into the season, as I said, it's early July. In my area, our first frost date estimate is about October 15th. It varies year to year what it actually ends up being, but October 15th is what I use for planting purposes. So there are really two categories of plants that you're going to want to think about when starting from seed this late in the season. The first is warm weather plants that have a really short maturity date. As I mentioned, it's the beginning of July here, and October 15th is my, as I said, estimated last frost date. So I counted out how many days that was, and I got right about 98 to 100 days till my last frost date. So what I want to think about when it comes to warm weather plants, warm weather plants, are plants that like to grow in warm weather, unsurprisingly. And those typically are plants that will be killed when we get our first frost. So when I'm looking for warm weather plants to grow, I want to plan on plants that can go from seed to harvest in less than that 98-day window. Now, the catch when you're planting plants towards the end of the season is that when we get close to our last frost date, one other thing that's going to happen, not only is the temperature going to be getting cooler, but the days are going to be getting shorter, the sun is going to be less directly overhead, and the plants will be getting less sunlight, which means they're going to be growing at a slower pace. Now, if you look at a seed packet and see that it says 60 days to maturity from seed to harvest, that's assuming perfect conditions. So when you're planting later in the season, you kind of want to add at least a week, maybe 2 weeks onto, I don't know what's going on in my chicken yard, they're very talkative this morning, but you kind of want to add a week to maybe 2 weeks onto the maturity date that your seed packet estimates. So for example, if I said 60 days, to be safe, to make sure that I was pretty much guaranteed to get a harvest, I'd want to estimate that plant will take me maybe 74 days or so to actually see a harvest. Now, the plus side of starting from seed this late in the season is that most plants, most warm weather plants anyway, will germinate much more quickly with the soil temperatures being warm like they are now. So that is a little bit of a bonus for us. And they will also grow much more quickly because everything is really warm. So I just want to show you guys a couple examples of warm weather plants with really quick maturity dates that I'm still planting from seed this time of year. So the first thing that I want to mention is cucumbers. So of course you're going to want to look at the specific varieties of cucumbers that you're interested in growing, but many cucumbers have a fairly short maturity date. So for example here, this cucumber variety estimates 60 days to maturity. Cucumbers are a plant that on the seed packet, when it gives you days to maturity, because these are plants that are usually direct sown, that means from when you put the seed in the ground to when you harvest your first cucumber. Now, as I said, I'm gonna wait for those birds to calm down a little bit. I'm out here first thing in the morning, and I think it is prime egg laying time, because there's definitely a ruckus going on over there. I'll be back in just a minute. My goodness, chickens. All right, I think they've calmed down somewhat. I still hear an occasional squawk, but it's not all of them all at once like it was before. So hopefully you'll be able to hear a little better now. So anyway, as I was saying, cucumbers can be a great vegetable to start this late in the season. Now, I am not actually planning on planting any more cucumbers at this point, but I have been regularly seeding cucumbers to replace cucumber seedlings that have been eaten by slugs up until maybe 2 weeks ago or so. And that is going to actually extend my cucumber harvest. Obviously, it was not in my original plan for half of my cucumber seedlings to get eaten by slugs. But since it did work out that way, what happened is that I have cucumbers coming in now, but then I have more cucumbers that are really just getting started. So by the time the cucumbers that I'm harvesting now are kind of on their way out, I should be onto my second harvest, or I should be harvesting from my second sowing of cucumbers. And I'm hoping that with how it kind of worked out, we should hopefully get fresh cucumbers all the way up until frost. We'll see what happens on that. Obviously, there are no guarantees in gardening, but I at least have a good shot of making that happen. So cucumbers are a great one that depending on, now I should put a caveat here. As I said, there's about 98 days left in my growing season. When you're deciding what to grow, you definitely want to first look at your growing season. You want to look at what date it is now, and you want to look at what date your estimated first frost is in your area. Now, many of you may have later estimated first frost dates than me, in which case you'll be able to grow more than what I'm sharing with you here. Some of you may have earlier frost dates, meaning you may not be able to grow everything that I'm going to mention. But if you know how many days are left in your growing season, that can give you a really great idea of where to start to look for maturity dates. So as I said, cucumbers are a great one to look into. The next thing I would recommend are beans. Now, bush beans especially typically have a very quick turnaround time. It's usually, so let's look at a couple options here. For example, I have this Maxabelle bean. This is a French fillet bean, and this says only 50 days to maturity. So this is a great option to sow this late in the season. Now, as I mentioned before, beans are one of those plants. They're a heat-loving plant. They'll germinate really quickly when your soil's really warm, like it typically is in most areas this time of year. So I do have lots of beans that I've recently sown, little seedlings coming up. So I'm really excited about that. I'm hoping that will extend my green bean harvest. Now, depending on your area and how many days you have left until your first frost, you may also be able to grow some varieties of pole beans as well. Now, a lot of these that I have here, I've saved my own seeds. So obviously I don't have maturity date on these packets here. But if we look here, this is a Vortex pole bean. It's one of my favorite varieties. This one says 60 days. Now that's 60 days seed to harvest. So that's another one that can be a great option. So if you want to look for pole beans that have a quick turnaround time like that, then that's a great option too. Now, at this time of year, I would probably personally still lean a little more heavily towards bush beans, just because bush beans are kind of the equivalent of determinate tomatoes. They tend to set a lot of their harvest in a shorter amount of time, where pole beans kind of set a little bit here and there. So what that means is that pole beans overall, you usually over the course of the season get a larger harvest from, where bush beans you get a little bit of a smaller harvest, but you get it all at once. So if you're trying to get in a last minute crop right before frost, you'll most likely get a larger harvest from bush beans. So that's what I would go with, but again, it really depends on how many days you have left in your frost-free growing season. Another great option that you can still plant from seed this time of year is summer squash. So see this zucchini here. This is the long white of Palermo zucchini. This says for maturity date, 45 to 55 days. That is crazy fast. So that means that you would be able to probably get several harvests off of one of these plants if you planted it now. So that is another great option. There's many other summer squash varieties that also have really quick maturity dates like that. So that's another great option to look into. You can also look into plants like basil. Now basil in my experience usually takes a little bit to really get started, but once it gets started, it grows really fast and provides a really good harvest. Another great thing about basil, being a smaller plant, you can always start it in a pot, and then if you're not satisfied with the amount of harvest that you got before frost, you can always bring it into your house before the frost comes, and that way you can really extend your harvest that way. So these are a few great options for heat-loving plants that you can still plant from seed this time of year. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. I'm sure there are many more heat-loving plants that you still have time to plant from seed before your first frost. This is what I'm personally planting in my garden, so that's what I'm sharing with you today. If you have any other suggestions for heat-loving plants that have a really quick turnaround time that you could still get a harvest from before the frost, go ahead and leave those in the comments because, you know, I'd love to get more ideas, and I'm sure other people watching this video would love to hear what recommendations you have as well. So that's heat-loving plants. The second category of plants that you can start from seed in July are cool weather plants. Those are plants that are typically going to live through the frost. So those don't necessarily have to have as quick of a maturity date as all these heat-loving plants that I mentioned. So that's going to include plants more like broccoli. So for example, broccoli typically takes a little bit longer, but broccoli can also survive a light frost. So while my first frost date, estimated is usually around October 15th, broccoli will usually keep going into November. So I have a little bit longer of a window. And I know in some places you'll be able to keep your broccoli going longer than that. That's going to be very area dependent, very individual climate dependent. So talking to local gardeners is a great option to get some really specific recommendations for your area. But when it comes to cool weather plants, we have lots of options. Now, one cool weather plant that I want to mention is lettuce. Lettuce, depending on your area, if you don't have really hot summers, you might be able to start lettuce now. The problem with starting lettuce from seed in July is that lettuce doesn't like to germinate in really hot soil. Lettuce prefers a little bit cooler temperatures. The other potential issue with starting lettuce from seed in July is that it tends to bolt really easily when it gets really hot, especially if it's hot and dry. So you can look for if you want to sow it outside now, you can look for summer varieties of lettuce. Those will tend to be a little bit more tolerant of higher temperatures. One other option would be to start some lettuce seeds inside your house and then transplant them out in a few weeks when they've had a little bit of a head start. If you wanted to go that route, really base it very much on your individual climate. You may even want to wait a few more weeks before going that route because you want it to, if you're doing that, you want it to maybe have started to cool down a little bit before your lettuce goes out, or at least for your days to have gotten a little bit shorter. So lettuce is one that, while I am not starting it from seed now, I will be starting some from seed really soon. I'll probably try direct sowing some lettuce, and I may also start some inside to transplant out into the garden. So that's another one to look into. As I said, that's going to be very area dependent, so you want to get recommendations from local gardeners on that one. Another option is radishes. While I probably wouldn't, honestly, we don't eat a lot of radishes, so I don't have a lot of experience growing radishes. The main reason that I grow them at all is for early spring growing because they grow so quickly. But that quick growing is something that you can also take advantage of this time of year. It is true that they do tend to develop a little bit of a stronger flavor when the temperatures are really high like they are now. So that may be something to keep in mind. That could be a benefit for you. It could be a negative depending on how you prefer your radishes to taste. So this is something that you may want to wait a little bit longer, but if you have cooler summers, then this might be a great option for something that you can go ahead and plant now. Because let's take a look at a couple of these here. For example, this lady slipper radish, days to maturity, 25 days. I mean, look at that. That's amazing, honestly, that you can plant a seed in the ground and be harvesting something 25 days from then. Now, as I said, this time of year, you may need to add a little bit of time onto those days to maturity. But even so, even if it takes 30, even 35 days, that's still crazy fast. Another thing to look into is different types of greens. I know I mentioned lettuce, but we have lots of other greens here. I've got arugula, I've got Swiss chard. Swiss chard Swiss chard might take a little bit longer. It depends on if you want to harvest it as baby Swiss chard or full-size Swiss chard. But Swiss chard is definitely one to look into, and Swiss chard is a little bit more heat tolerant than a lot of other summer greens that you'll find. So there's lots of greens out there, including lots of interesting Asian greens that you can look into. Tatsoi could be a great option. Pak choi could be a great option. So go ahead and look into all those greens. Look into how long the maturity date is to see when you need to start those to be able to get a harvest before frost. But really, those greens, many of them will survive long after frost, and with a little bit of protection, they'll survive even longer. So those can be some great options as well. One other option to start now or really soon is peas. Now again, the exact timing of starting peas is going to be really area and weather dependent. I honestly have not had the greatest luck growing a fall crop of peas. I always tend to guess wrong and start them at the wrong time. Probably what I'm going to do this year, and we'll see if it works. My spring peas are pretty much done. They're winding down. There's only a few peas left, and the plants themselves are starting to kind of dry up a little bit. I'm probably going to pull those out, amend the soil, and plant a fresh crop of fall peas there pretty much right away. So I'll keep you posted on that. We'll see how it works. Hopefully we get some delicious fall peas this year. Now, Asian greens, I kind of mentioned those when I was talking about greens before. But we see we've got pak choi. This is one of my favorites, which I don't know how to pronounce. So I'll just let you see the packet there. A couple different varieties of pak choi. So lots of different options to look into in that category there. Another great option is kale. Now, kale is a great plant to grow if you want to extend your harvest season because kale is very frost resistant. So kale is another one that doesn't really like heat all that much. So depending on your area, you might be able to direct sow this outside. It might do better if you start it inside and transplant it out. In my area, I find that kale generally does better, and really all of the brassicas, broccoli, cauliflower, cabbage, all of those really do better if I transplant them, not even just because of weather, but because I find that a lot of times if I direct sow them, the tiny seedlings are eaten by pests as soon as they come up. So if I start them, sometimes I'll start them in my house if I want to control the weather a little bit more. Well, wouldn't we all love to control the weather? If I want to control the environment that they're growing in a little bit more. Sometimes I will start them in little pots on my deck, which will protect them from pests, but they'll be immediately hardened off to the weather. So that's another option that you can look into. So broccoli kind of falls into that same category. Broccoli is one, depending on your area, should probably be started pretty soon. And this is another one that I like to start inside or in pots on my deck and then transplant out to the garden later. And then cabbage, similarly to broccoli and similarly to kale, those are all in the same family. So there are so many plants that you can start from seed now and get a great harvest. As I said, you'll both be extending the harvest season of your summer garden, and then really a lot of the cool weather plants that I mentioned really fall into the category of fall gardening. So there is so much that you can do, and I know that it's easy to get burned out in the garden this time of year when it's so hot and there's so many pests and you're harvesting and preserving, and sometimes the plants get diseases. I mean, there's a lot going on. But sowing a little bit of seed in the ground, I find, doesn't really take that much energy or effort or time. And I find that when the weather starts to cool down and I'm able to keep harvesting, I really do appreciate the effort that earlier me put into making that harvest a possibility. So I encourage you to look for spaces in your garden and see what you can still start from seed even in July. So if there's anything that I missed on this list, and I'm sure there are many things that I missed, go ahead and let me know in the comments, because I would love to hear, as I said, both your warm weather plants that have a quick maturity date and your cool weather plants that will extend your garden season into the fall. So I hope you're having a great day, and I can't wait to see you soon. I'll see you next time.